Everything's hunky-dory. Life is good. Life is sweet. Become apparent later about that title. But when you think all is well, life is sweet, life is good, everything's hunky-dory. We go to the next slide. Last time I spoke, we looked at 1 Peter 3:10. For he that will love life and see good days, let him refrain his tongue from evil and his lips that they speak no guile. If you're somebody who wants to love life, Peter was writing this to Christians, then you've got to be careful about what you say. Words are important. And interestingly enough, the word for love there is agapeo, which is the highest form of love. It's God's type of love. And the word for life there is zoe, which is God's type of life. So if you want to have God's love for God's type of life, then you have got to speak a particular way. You've got to watch what you say. Words are important. They're not recognized for what they are amongst Christians, unfortunately, but words are important. And if we go to Proverbs 18:21, which I've looked at a few times, but Solomon writes this, he says, the tongue has the power of life and death, and those who love it will eat its fruit. If you are going to speak words of life, you will reap life. If you speak words of death, you will reap death. It's as simple as that. And that's a universal law that applies to Christians and non-Christians. It's more relevant to Christians because of how we can back our words up, the power that can be behind them through what Christ has done. But the first thing to realize is what we say is important. Watch what you say. It's as simple as that. What comes out of your mouth is important. And if you want a bit more reassurance on that, then let's go to the next slide. And this is Jesus himself speaking. And he says this, but I tell you, on the day of judgment, people will have to give an accounting for every careless or useless word they speak. And I've chosen the Amplified because it uses sort of those words, careless or useless words. You know, how many of the words we speak would come under the category of being careless or useless, pointless, not worthy of being said? But we probably are all guilty of doing that. That words slip out of our mouth, often unintentionally, but if we recognize the power behind words, then, as David said in the Psalms, he said, O Lord, set a guard upon my mouth. Set a guard upon my mouth. And so we continue to look at words. And I'm going back into the Old Testament now. We go to 2 Kings chapter 4. And this is a particular story in the life of Elisha and a woman of Shunem. I've chosen the ESV version as well, the English Standard Version, because it uses a particular phrase. And I think the particular phrase is very succinct, very poignant, and one that will stick in our minds. And so we read, one day Elisha went on to Shunem, where a wealthy woman lived, who urged him to eat some food. So whenever he passed that way, he would turn in there to eat food. And she said to her husband, behold, now I know that this is a holy man of God, who is continually passing our way. Let us make a small room on the roof with walls and put there for him a bed, a table, a chair, and a lamp, so that whenever he comes to us, he can go in there. So basically, Elisha spent time with this woman of Shunem, and Must have been quite regularly. And the woman said, well, he spends a lot of time here. Let's make his life easier. Let's make a room for him. And when he passes by, he can stay there. He can refresh himself. He can spend the night here. And so we go on to the next slide. The woman, her husband had made the room, and so one day he came there and he turned into the chamber and rested there. And he said to Gehazi, his servant, call this Shunammite. And when he had called her, she stood before him, and he said to him, say now to her, see, look, you've taken all this trouble for us, you've made this room for us, you feed us, you look after us. What can I do for you? What is to be done for you? And this is quite fascinating in itself. And Elisha says, would you have me speak on your behalf to the king? Would you have me speak on your behalf to the commander of the army? Now that shows that Elisha had quite a lot of influence. Not many people would be able to speak directly to the king and ask a favour or talk to the commander of the army. Her reply is a bit odd, but I think basically, you know, she answers, I dwell among my people. I think you can paraphrase that as, I'm quite happy. I don't need you to do anything on my behalf. But Elisha really does want to do something for her. She's been incredibly accommodating. She's been incredibly hospitable. And so we go to the next slide. And so Elisha speaks to his servant Gehazi. And he said to Gehazi, what then is to be done for this woman? Gehazi answered, well, she doesn't have a son, and her husband is old. And so Elisha says, call her. And when he had called her, she stood in the doorway, and he said, at this season, about this time next year, you shall embrace a son. And she replies, no, Lord, O man of God, do not lie to your servant. But the woman conceived, and she bore a son about that time the following spring, as Elisha had said to her. So basically, the Shunammite woman and her husband, they don't have any children, and Elisha wants to bless them. Gehazi, the servant, says, well, she doesn't have any children. She can't have children. She's incapable, or her husband can't, or she can't. Whatever the reason, they can't have children. And so Elisha, wanting to bless this woman for all that she has done for him, says, in a year's time, you will have a son. In a year's time, you will have a son. And it comes to pass that she does have a son. It comes exactly as Elisha says. So if we go to the next slide, we continue the story in 2 Kings 4. When the child had grown, he went out one day to his father among the reapers. And he said to his father, oh, my head, my head. And the father said to his servant, carry him back to his mother. And when he had lifted him and brought him to his mother, the child sat on her lap till noon and then died. That must have been incredibly traumatic for her. This miracle child. They couldn't have children. Elisha said, you will have a child. She had a child. And then comes this day where he complains of a severe headache. He's carried back to his mother. The child rests his head on her lap. And then when noon comes, he dies. How tragic, how awful. Continue the story. Next slide, please, Nigel. So she goes up and she lays her dead boy on the bed of the man of God, on Elisha's bed in the room that's been constructed for him, shuts the door behind him and went out. Then she calls to her husband and says, send me one of the servants and one of the donkeys, then I may quickly go to the man of God and come back again. And he said, well, why will you go to him today? Why will you go to him today? And he said, it's neither a new moon nor a Sabbath. It's like her husband says, well, why are you going to see the prophet? You know, it's not a religious day. You don't have to be religious today. It's a non-religious day. You know, you can tell who had the faith. You can tell who was probably the more God-fearing. But she then says something, and we're going to stop there. She says to her husband something. She said, now, bearing in mind what's happened, her son complains of a headache, brought back to her, lays his head in her lap, and at noon of that day, the boy dies. She then wants to go to Elisha to talk to him, discuss things. Husband says to her, well, why are you going off to see Elisha? Not a special day. And she replies, now, ask yourself the question, how would you reply in her situation? What would you have said? I can guarantee in 99.9999% of all cases, the phrase, our son is dead, would have cropped up. I can guarantee it. If you were in her position, that phrase would crop up pretty quickly. But what does she say? And this becomes interesting. And this is where the title comes from, and you may already have got it. But she says this, all is well. She lying? Is all well? The son's just died. And yet she makes this statement, all is well. The actual word used here in the Hebrew is shalom, which often means peace, but it can be well. And the implication, no, everything's okay. Everything is hunky-dory. Everything is right with the world. All is good. All is well. Well, bearing in mind what's happened, that is a tremendous statement. That is a tremendous thing to say in that situation. All is well. Continue the story. Go to the next slide. She saddles the donkey and she says to her servant, urge the animal on. Do not slacken the pace for me until I tell you. I'm in a hurry. So she set out and came to the man of God, Elisha, at Mount Carmel. When the man of God saw her coming, he said to Gehazi, his servant, look, there is the Shunammite. Run at once to meet her and say to her, is all well with you? Is all well with your husband? Is all well with the child? And she answered, you should know by now. Next slide. All is well. You know, the question's been asked. Is the child okay? Is your husband okay? Are you okay? Shalom. All is well. Tremendous words. And this is the second time she has now said it. All is well. And we skip a few verses, but basically Elisha meets the woman. She sort of is quite distraught. Elisha says, well, I don't really know what's wrong with the situation. God hasn't revealed to me what's going on. She doesn't actually say what's going on. But he senses things are not right. And he sends his servant, and he says to his servant, go and lay my staff on the boy, and he will be brought back to life. Gehazi does it. Doesn't happen for him. And so Elisha has to go. And so we come to the next slide. When Elisha came into the house, he saw the child lying dead on his bed. So he went in and shut the door behind the two of them and prayed to the Lord. And then he went up and lay on the child, putting his mouth on his mouth, his eyes on his eyes, and his hands on his hands. And as he stretched himself upon him, the flesh of the child became warm. Go to the next slide. Elisha gets up. He got up again and walked once back and forth in the house and went up and stretched himself upon him. The child sneezed 7 times, and the child opened his eyes. Then he summoned Gehazi and said, "Call this Shunammite." So he called her, and when she came to him, he said, "Pick up your son. Your son is alive." Go to the next slide. All is well. You see, this is about words. In the most challenging of situations, what comes out of our mouth? This is obviously an extreme situation, but ask yourself the question, would that phrase be the first phrase out of your mouth? I can hold my hands up and say, yes, it definitely would. You little liar. It would be at the back of my mind, but I would have many, many emotions going on, many things occurring. It's not to say that she doesn't have the emotional response, because she does when she comes to Elisha. But she has this at the back of her mind, this thing, all is well. All is well. You see, the question is, was she lying when she said all is well? If you looked at the situation with human eyes, you would see a dead boy. But I don't think in any way whatsoever she was looking at it from a human point of view. She was looking at it from a spiritual point of view. Yes, my senses are telling me one thing, but my spirit is telling me something else. And what rose to the surface in her life and what became paramount was that phrase, all is well. You see, it's how you look at situations as to what you can speak into those situations. Do you see with the human senses, or do you see from a spiritual perspective? We looked before that in Colossians, Paul says, we're to set our minds in the heavenly realms. We're to set our hearts in the heavenly realms. Basically, that's about having a heavenly perspective on earthly situations, looking at things from God's point of view, from above, looking down on them. This is how God sees them. This is how I'm to see them. I'm looking at them with the spiritual perspective. And when you start looking at situations differently, looking at them from God's point of view, you can change situations. And I believe because she had in her mind all is well, this is how the situation developed and how her son was brought back to life for her. Because she had that mentality, all is well. This will work out. This will work out. You see, it's all about perspective in situations. How you see them. Whether you see them humanly or whether you see them spiritually. Different people will see situations differently. You may be in circumstances where you will speak out in challenging times, in difficult circumstances to a non-Christian friend, all is well. And they will look at you and say, really? You've got to be kidding. You've got to be joking. You're in a dire situation. Yeah, but we have God on our side. Big difference. You know, this is an Old Testament example that in a challenging situation, her response was all is well. Let's go to a New Testament example. This is from the life of Jesus. It's Matthew 9, various verses, and you'll know this story. While Jesus was saying this, a synagogue leader came and knelt before him and said, "My daughter has just died, but come and put your hand on her and she will live." Jesus got up and went with him, and so did his disciples. When Jesus entered the synagogue leader's house and saw the noisy crowd and people playing pipes, he said, "Go away. This girl is not dead, but asleep." What was their response? They laughed at him. After the crowd had been put outside, he went in and he took the girl by the hand and she got up. See, it's, he said, the girl is not dead but asleep. And everybody else around him laughed at him and said, "You're stupid. That kid is dead. That kid is not moving. That kid is perhaps cold. That kid is dead." And they were laughing at Jesus because they were looking at the situation and they saw a dead body. And they knew that was a dead body. And yet Jesus was looking at it with a very different perspective. And he said, "No, that boy is sleeping." And Jesus proved the point because he woke him up. That's powerful. But again, in both these stories, what is your perspective? What is the perspective you have on a situation? Is it through the senses or is it spiritually? Do your senses say the boy is dead? And does your mouth say the boy is dead? And does your thinking say the boy is dead? Or do you say, no, the kid is asleep? Or do you say all is well? Again, these are extreme situations. But let's think about the ordinary challenges we face in life. Not of this magnitude. And yet the response we have would not be all is well. And so Jesus raises the child to life. And so we come to the next slide. All is well. You see, we know the end of these stories. And so the statement, all is well, is true right at the very end. But I think where God wants us to get to is to a point to have the faith and the belief and the trust and the speech to back up what we want to occur in the future in the now with what we say. What I want is this to happen. I haven't got it, but this is what I want to happen. And I'm going to declare this out until such time as it becomes true. And here we have two accounts in the Bible where this is what occurs. It's possible. And words in both situations are important. You go to the next slide. The child was born a year later, so we're going back early in the story before the child is born. And the question I would ask is, how would she have felt during the first 3 months? Elisha has said to her, "You will have a child this time next year." How would she have felt in the first 3 months? We go to the next slide. She's obviously got to wait. And if we look at 2 Kings 4:16, Elisha says at this season, about this time next year, you shall embrace a son. Look at her reply. "No, Lord, O man of God, do not lie to your servant." Don't lie. Don't mislead me. He says she's going to have a son. He then disappears off the scene, and then time would have gone on. Now, the first month, she would have had her period, and she thought, well, I'm not having a child. Maybe he did lie to me. Maybe that might have flickered through her mind. Don't forget, this is right early on in the story. A lot occurs to increase her faith, I think. Second month comes, she has her period. Still no sign of a son. Is she still having the right mentality? Because in this, it's recorded that she says to Elisha, do not lie to me. Don't tell me an untruth. And I've included the verse from the Voice translation because I think it's quite good, her reply. Elisha, this time next year when spring is full of new life, you will hold a son of your own in your arms. Shunammite woman's reply, that's impossible, my Lord. That's impossible. That ain't going to happen. Because I know more than you do. I know that's just not on the cards. So please don't deceive me. It's interesting that Elisha speaks and her response to what he says, she's doubting him. She is calling him a liar. You know, that's just not going to happen. You get this, Elisha speaks words and she's in a position of doubting. No, that's not going to happen. And so she may well have done in the first 3 months, thought, well, he did lie to me. You know, what he said, the words he spoke were not correct. But we know from the end of the story that the words he spoke were correct. He saw things at that point in time from a different perspective to the way she was seeing them. So there's a bit of a twist going on. And then we come to the next slide. This is another interesting question. Why did she have to wait a year for the child? Why didn't Elisha, he could have said, well, you'll have a son, and that could have happened within a couple of weeks. Why a year? Well, go back to what Elisha said, 2 Kings 4:16, and it's all in his words. What does Elisha say to her? At this season, about this time next year, you will have a son. Elisha is declaring out the exact time that she will have a son in her arms. And he says, by his words, and words are full of life, in a year's time, you will have a son in your arms. And God heard Elisha's words and responded accordingly, I believe, and said, well, you want it in a year? A year's when it's going to happen. Because that's what you've said. And that's why it was a year, because Elisha said it would be a year. It was his words. See, this is the power of words. This is the power of speaking out in situations and what can happen. But you're going to have to see things differently. You're going to have to see things from a spiritual perspective. You're going to have to see things from God's point of view. You're going to have to go against all your human senses when you start declaring out words of life into situations which apparently are anything but. But we know from these stories we've looked at what happens when people declare out words of life, words that are different to the way the world speaks. And we just finish with the last slide. And you can guess what's coming up. All is well. You might forget everything I've said this morning, but I can guarantee you will not forget that phrase. Whatever situations you face in life, and we all face challenging times, that goes with the territory of being a human being on this planet. That's the way it is. It's not God bringing it into our lives. Many times it's us just making dreadful mistakes. Sometimes it's the enemy getting in the way. Sometimes it's just a fallen world. But how we respond to these situations is incredibly important. And so can I encourage you, and I'll encourage myself, when you face these challenging situations in life, may these be the first 3 words into your mind and out of your mouth. All is well. We can influence what happens by the power of our words, because Solomon said in Proverbs, the tongue has the power of life and death. what you say has an impact. Amen.